Alright, so let's talk about a game that you might not have known existed, or maybe you just forgot about. Back in the mid-2000s, arcade racing games were literally everywhere. This was the golden era, fast, loud, chaotic, and sometimes maybe even just a little bit stupid in the best possible way. You had Need for Speed reinventing itself, there was Midnight Club, and then there was one very specific king of destruction, Burnout 3 Takedown. So imagine trying to release a crash-heavy arcade racer in that exact same window, and that's exactly what today's game did. Welcome to the Worst Racing Games, the internet series where you guys suggest different racing games that you think are terrible, then I play them, review them, and rank them. So, last week we covered the Japanese exclusive Namco open world racer Critical Velocity, and honestly, it was a lot of fun. So let's see what the wheel has in store for us this week, and we have Crash and Burn. This is such a fascinating game because this isn't really a bad clone, it's a game with ideas, some weird ideas, some frustrating ideas, and occasionally brilliant ideas. So today we're diving deep into it, what it tried to do, what it actually did, and why it ended up being one of those almost interesting games that kinda got forgotten to time. So Crash and Burn released across November and December of 2004 for the PlayStation 2 and original Xbox. It was developed by Climax Racing, who later went on to be known by Black Rock Studio, as in the same guys behind Pure and Split Second Velocity, and the game was published by Eidos. At its core, Crash and Burn is exactly what the name suggests it is. You race, you crash, and eventually, you will probably burn. There's no complicated setup here, no story, no characters you're supposed to care about, it's just pure arcade chaos. You pick a car, enter a race, and try to finish first, or survive, which is simple really. But the twist, or the thing that sets the game apart, is that destruction isn't just a spectacle, it's literally the entire system. See, in most racing games, if you crash, you reset, maybe you lose speed, maybe you rewind, maybe you explode in dramatic slow motion like in Burnout. But in Crash and Burn, the wreck stays. Every crash, every explosion, every destroyed car, they don't disappear, they become part of the track and an obstacle in itself. And that's where the game gets really interesting. Each race starts with 16 cars, and by the end of the race, yeah, there are still 16 cars on the track, but not all of them are functional anymore. Some are wrecked, some are burning, some are just sitting there like metal roadblocks waiting to ruin your race. So instead of just racing your opponents, you're constantly navigating an evolving obstacle course made up of the consequences of everyone's mistakes. And on paper, that's a pretty brilliant idea because it means every lap changes and the track gets more dangerous over time. And theoretically, it creates these dynamic, unpredictable races where anything can happen. But in practice, well, we'll get to that. Now before we go any further, if you're new around here and you haven't considered doing so already, then please hit that subscribe button and tap the bell for notifications to stay up to date with my future uploads. And whilst I'm at it, if you want to get your hands on some cool goodies like early access to videos, exclusive Discord server roles, and names in the credits of my uploads, as well as, just watching ad-free videos, then consider joining my Patreon using the link in the description below. Anyway, thanks for supporting the channel, let's get back to Crash and Burn. So let's talk about how it actually feels to play. The driving itself is very arcadey, obviously, super simple controls, accelerate, brake, steer, boost. There's obviously nothing sim-like here, no weighty physics or precision handling. You pick it up and within about 30 seconds, you pretty much understand everything. And that's a good thing because the game throws chaos at you almost immediately. Cars are constantly bumping into each other, the AI is aggressive, borderline reckless, I would argue maybe even stupid, and collisions are frequent. You're not just racing clean lines around corners, you're fighting for space, and sometimes you're just fighting for your life. Now when crashes happen, they are messy. Cars flip, they spin, and get launched across the track. Flames erupt, debris flies everywhere. It's not as polished or cinematic as Burnout, but it definitely has a scrappy charm. But the problem is, the game doesn't really balance that chaos. So remember that cool idea about the persistent wrecks on track? Yeah, that's also the game's biggest problem, because as races go on, the track doesn't just get more interesting, it can get worse. Wrecked cars start piling up in the worst possible places, like tight corners, blind jumps, narrow sections, and eventually it stops feeling like a dynamic system, and it just starts feeling like traffic hell. There are moments, especially in later races, where you literally can't avoid collisions. You turn a corner, and suddenly there's a wall of destroyed cars blocking your path, and your only option is drive straight into it and hope for the best. It's less skillful racing and more controlled chaos roulette. And that might sound fun, and sometimes it genuinely is, but when you're trying to win, or it's like a championship, it's just incredibly frustrating. And the AI does not help, at all. The CPU drivers are, how do I put this nicely, not smart. They don't avoid wrecks effectively, they don't really adapt, they just keep driving like everything is fine, smashing into obstacles over and over again. Which sounds funny, and it is at first, and can be in certain situations, but it leads to weird situations where sometimes most of the field wipes itself out. You'll finish races where only a handful of cars actually cross the line, and there's been a couple where it's literally just been me. And success often comes down to one thing in this game, and that's just getting ahead early, because if you get caught in the pack when things start going wrong, which is, turn 1 basically, that's it. Your race is basically over. You get stuck in pile-ups, lose too much time, or take too much damage, and there's no real way to recover from that. So instead of exciting back and forth racing with some scrapping, you end up restarting races just to get a better start, which isn't exactly thrilling gameplay. Now, to its credit, Crash and Burn does try to mix things up. There are several different race modes, and some of them are genuinely quite entertaining. You've got your standard races, of course, but then there's stuff like Kamikaze mode, where half the cars drive one way around the track, and the other half go the opposite direction. And yes, it's exactly as chaotic as it sounds. The first lap in this mode is basically a demolition derby. Cars smashing head on, explosions everywhere. It's ridiculous and honestly one of the highlights of the game. There's also modes like Last Man Standing, all designed to lean into the destruction heavy gameplay, and while none of them are super deep, they do add some variety, but the problem is they don't really fix the core issues at hand. So the tracks themselves are based on real world cities across America, like Miami, Las Vegas, and San Francisco, but don't expect anything too detailed. These are pretty simple circuits, short laps, basic layouts, not a lot of technical complexity, and at first that does work in the game's favour, because the simplicity makes it easier to learn tracks quickly, but over time, they start to feel repetitive. And worse, some of them are clearly not designed with the wreck system in mind, like narrow roads, tight choke points, and awkward intersections. These areas become disaster zones once wrecks start piling up. There are even intersections with live traffic crossing through them, adding another layer of unpredictability, which again sounds cool until it completely ruins your race. Now, one thing to give credit to these tracks, something that annoys me in some racing games is when instead of upping the difficulty as you progress, they just make the races longer by adding more laps, which means sometimes if you're on a longer track, you're going to be playing one single race for like 15 minutes. But in this game, even though sometimes they do go up to 8, maybe even 12 laps, laps usually take like 30 seconds, sometimes less, so races still don't feel too long, even when you have a lot of laps to do it in. Now, in terms of progression, it's very straightforward. You win races, you earn money, and you use that money to upgrade your cars. There are 4 main vehicle types, so compact, pickup, muscle, and sports, and each one has its own feel, though the differences aren't really that big. Upgrades focus on 3 main areas, which is engine, gearbox, and tyres. but the game doesn't really explain that to you. So from the shop you can buy all kinds of customizable appearance things like spoilers, rims, so on, but there's also one that just says upgrade. It doesn't say what the upgrade does, but you buy it. But what it doesn't tell you is you have to go to the garage to actually apply the upgrade you've bought, and it's basically just a skill point that you can put into one of those 3 different things I mentioned: engine, gearbox, or tyres. And even once you figure that out, the upgrades don't feel very impactful anyway. You'll improve stats, sure, so on screen it looks nice, but the handling doesn't really change dramatically. It never feels like you're transforming your car, so progression just kind of becomes more about numbers than the actual experience, and that makes it less satisfying over time. But, to the game's credit, there are a lot of visual customization options, like loads and loads, so that is cool. Now, in terms of visuals, I would say the game is pretty decent. The cars have a kind of toy-like look to them, almost like Hot Wheels models. There's bright colours, simple shapes, nothing too detailed, but there are some nice reflections. And that works. The environments are a bit more hit or miss, city tracks do feel kind of bland, while some of the more natural locations, like forests or canyon areas, look better pretty much thanks to the more varied colours. The real focus though, of course, is on destruction. And while crashes can be entertaining, the effects themselves aren't the best, but they are still good. The fire looks alright, debris is a bit random, and the sparks are meh. But what is impressive is how much debris is on the track at any time. Now of course, this is emulated, so I can't talk for how this game actually handled that debris being on track at all times on the PS2, because I'm sure there probably were some fairly heavy frame rate drops during some big pile-ups or intense fire effects. But one thing I did notice, for a game that's about being quite fast, it doesn't feel very fast. Even when you're boosting, it feels like you're slightly above normal driving speed. And I feel like that lack of intensity does hold it back just a little bit. Now the audio is another mixed bag. The crashes sound pretty good, big heavy impacts that definitely sell the destruction, but everything else is kind of just Engines all sound kind of the same, and there's no real personality here. The soundtrack's not bad, it's got this high energy rock licensed song vibe, but there aren't many songs on there. I heard like the same 4 or 5 on repeat. And then there's the announcer, who is weirdly enthusiastic about destruction and, well, death. Lines like "somebody call 911" get repeated a lot, and it can be funny. There are moments where the dialogue is funny, but because there aren't many lines, as you play through the games you hear just the same thing over and over again, and it starts to feel less exciting and more just a bit awkward. Now, one other thing I will quickly mention before talking about review scores, sales, and the tier list ranking is something that I thought was pretty cool that I wasn't actually able to test. And that's online play, where you could apparently race against up to 15 other players, and if you didn't have that many, the AI would fill the gaps to keep the races full. And honestly, that's where the game would make the most sense, because those human players would bring unpredictability in a way that feels way more natural than the AI chaos. Plus, showing off your customized cars and smashing into your friends would have added a layer of fun that the single player does sometimes lack. Of course, today those servers are long gone, but you know, it's still worth mentioning because that was a cool feature back then. So in terms of critical response, the PlayStation 2 version of the game currently holds a 63 out of 100 on Metacritic, and honestly, critics appear to be incredibly divided on this game. And I know professional video game critic opinions don't really matter in the long run, I just think it's interesting to look back through that lens. So there are scores as high as 80, but as low as 40, so God knows what the guy who gave it 40 was thinking that day. But in terms of user scores, which I would take with a bit more credibility, the PS2 version currently holds a 7.8 out of 10, with scores as high as 9 out of 10 and low as 6, which again is still a lot more fair. Now in terms of sales figures, the PS2 version of the game supposedly went on to sell about 200,000 copies worldwide, which for a lesser known kind of lower budget racing game on the PS2 is pretty good going in my eyes. Those stats are of course from VG charts. Okay, so now the time has come to rank Crash and Burn on our worst racing games tier list. Now before I add it on, I do just have to say we have made one, hopefully final, adjustment to the tier list, because there appeared to be some confusion about what actually Not That Bad meant as a tier. So for me, that meant anything the actually not that bad was a good game, and I appreciate the wording was a bit weird, so I've now separated that into two different categories. So we've got good at the very top, and actually not that bad will now be the tier below. So I've moved games like Road Trip Adventure and Critical Velocity up to good, and left Need for Speed Carbon Own the City on PSP, My Sims Racing, so on, and actually not that bad. So hopefully that makes a bit more sense now. Anyway, let's rank Crash and Burn on that list. So this game for me is going at the very top of actually not that bad. It's very close to being in that good tier, but there's just some issues that needed to be ironed out, like the sense of speed, the stupid AI, and sometimes the wrecks being placed in the most ridiculous places. But overall, it's still a fun time, and if you can check it out, I would say you should check it out, especially if you're a fan of that kind of racing game. So unfortunately for Crash and Burn, it did release in the shadow of Burnout 3 Takedown, which was a game that delivered a similar fantasy, but of course with way more polish, speed, and satisfaction, and a soundtrack that I would argue is probably the best licensed soundtrack of all time. Obviously that's up for debate because there's a lot of good licensed soundtracks, but for me it's the most nostalgic one, so of course I'll defend it. But the point is, Crash and Burn never really stood a chance, but at the same time it did try something different. And even if it didn't fully succeed, I think that still makes it worth remembering. And so that takes us to the end of our look at Crash and Burn on the PlayStation 2. Would you rank it any differently, and what do you think of the game? Let me know in the comments down below, and if you have a suggestion you want to see added to the wheel, pop that down there as well. Thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting that like button, and if you haven't done so already, please consider hitting that subscribe button to stay up to date with my future uploads. A massive shout out to my Patreon subscribers for the continued support, and all I really have left to say is thank you and goodbye.